This is Mike Bevel. You are watching Footnotes, where we are reading Middlemarch, and the longest cat in the world is sleeping behind me. Please also take full note of the sweat. Oh, yeah. Oh, it's like magic what's happening. It's just been disgusting in the DC metro area. And it's global warming and all the other terrible decisions that we made and didn't know we were making, but also knew that we were making. That's a fun pose to be in. Oh, I don't know if you see, like on that pillow back there, I'm reading a book right now about the affair of the poisons, and it's written by, you know what, I won't say her name, so she won't ever know that I don't like her book, but Anne Somerset. Is that it? Maybe. Anyway, she's kind of sexist in a way, like she just, I don't know. I think she doesn't go deep enough. We're not here to talk about the affair of the poisons. We're here to read Middlemarch together. And so let's do that. And I'm going to bring up this. All right, so we open with a short piece of writing by George Eliot. That is either an epigram or an epigraph. We will never learn that. Oh, sir, the loftiest hopes on earth draw lots with meaner hopes. Heroic breasts, breathing bad air, run risk of pestilence, or, lacking lime juice when they cross the line, may languish with scurvy. I wonder if line and scurvy are supposed to rhyme in the way that swans and stones are supposed to rhyme in the wild swans at Cool by, is it Yeats? Maybe? That guy's a weirdo. Let's try that again. Some weeks passed after this conversation before the question of the chaplaincy gathered any practical import for Lydgate. And without telling himself the reason, he deferred the predetermination on which side he would give his vote. It would really have been a matter of total indifference to him. That is to say, he would have taken the more convenient side and given his vote for the appointment of Tyke without any hesitation, if he had not cared personally for Mr. Fairbrother. But his liking for the vicar of St. Botolph's grew with a growing acquaintanceship, that entering into Lydgate's position as a newcomer who had his own professional objects to secure, Mr. Fairbrother should have taken pains rather to warn off than to obtain his interest, showed an unusual delicacy and generosity, which Lydgate's nature was keenly alive to. Yeah, so I think last time I wasn't totally sold, like, was the last chapter hot or not? That's something you can vote on in your heart. But also, I wasn't sort of crazy about how Eliot was writing them in that chapter, because I didn't think they were making super great decisions, but I was basing that on like my 21st and beyond brain to her late 19th century brain, thinking about an early 19th century time that she really wasn't alive for. Anyway, so I think we are to get from this that Fairbrother is a good man. And she might even be saying he's also a good Christian, which wouldn't, I think, this is one of the reasons why I think we can't call Eliot an atheist, because I don't think she denies that experience for others. I think in her worldview, you can be Christian and be good, which is the flip side of how that usually goes, which is if you aren't Christian, you're almost definitely not good, or you're not moral is the better word to use. And George Eliot says, hold my gold, and just barrels into the argument saying, look, this is what I can show you what moral behavior looks like outside of God. Like, God doesn't play a big part in her novels. And she's showing characters who aren't necessarily religious characters behaving with incredible moral certainty and also with the ability to change their minds about that. So I think one of the things I would love to, like, if I got to have dinner with George Eliot, like, I would really want to talk about how she experiences and experienced faith. Um, I think it would be a fascinating conversation, and I bet she would be a super funny conversationalist because she was really known by others for her wit. Would really like to, like, I think she would be more interesting to hang out with than Charles Dickens, who I love a lot. But I think Charles Dickens would just be too busy performing Charles Dickens for you, that because he can't tell the difference between the fake Charles Dickens and the real Charles Dickens are all the same to him. Whereas I think George Eliot would just be a human being. Ooh. I think Wilkie Collins would too. Okay. But his liking for the vicar of St. Botolph's grew with growing acquaintanceship, that entering into Lydgate's position as a newcomer who had his own professional object to secure, Mr. Fairbrother should have taken pains rather to warn off than to obtain his interest, showed an unusual delicacy and generosity, which Lydgate's nature was keenly alive to. It went along with other points of conduct in Mr. Fairbrother, which were exceptionally fine, and made his character resemble those southern landscapes which seemed divided between natural grandeur and social slovenliness. So this is a footnote that has nothing to do with Middlemarch, but that idea of southern landscapes divided between natural grandeur and social slovenliness. Thomas Mann, who you may know from such hits as Faust, not Goethe's Faust, of course, that's by Goethe. This is Thomas Mann's Faust, about a pianist, or Magic Mountain, about tuberculosis, or Death in Venice, about a sympathetic pedophile. I'm kidding. He is not sympathetic, except maybe, I don't know. This is not probably the time or place to talk about any of that. But Mann is interesting in Death in Venice about sort of the corrupting influence of Italy, the south of Europe, and sort of that hot Mediterranean steamy climate compared to Mann's sort of northern, we're cold all the time and rugged. That sort of that difference he explores a lot in Death in Venice. And the guy who we may or may not believe is, of course he is, he's a pedophile. The pedophile succumbs to cholera, which is code for diarrhea. So he gets he doesn't come out, I was gonna say he doesn't come out clean, but I'm not a drive time DJ. This is not that kind of video series. I'm disappointed that I even took us in this direction, but we live here now. I'll keep going. Let's find a new place to live. Very few men could have been as filial and chivalrous as he was to the mother, aunt, and sister whose dependence on him had in many ways shaped his life rather uneasily for himself. Few men who feel the pressure of small needs are so nobly resolute not to dress up their inevitably self-interested desires in a pretext of better motives. In these matters, he was conscious that his life would bear the closest scrutiny. And perhaps the consciousness encouraged a little defiance towards the critical strictness of persons whose celestial intimacies seem not to improve their domestic manners, and whose lofty aims were not needed to account for their actions. That's George Eliot sort of being the way we are sometimes, especially about prosperity gospel preachers. Like, Fairbrother is walking the walk and talking the talk that we would want from someone who is expressing Christian identity. We are going to talk at some point about the fact that I have crucifixes in my room. But we're not going to talk about that right now. Anyway, I think that that George Eliot is making a strong distinction here between people who are just into this for it being a profession. I think she finds that to be in poor taste. And those who appear to be acting Christ-like in the world, which is where I think she might be sending Fairbrother. Now remember, I have not finished this book. It could turn out that Fairbrother is a rampant Satanist, and there is a delightful Matthew Lewis from the Monk style orgy of demons at some point that Fairbrother is choreographing. But let's just assume that that's not the case. But I just also want to say, if it is the case, I called it at chapter 18. In these matters, he was conscious that his life would bear the closest scrutiny, and perhaps a consciousness encouraged a little defiance towards the critical strictness of persons whose celestial intimacies seem not to improve their domestic manners, and whose lofty aims were not needed to account for their actions. Then his preaching was ingenious and pithy, like the preaching of the English church in its robust age. And so we all are on the same page here. The English church is the Anglican church created by Henry VIII. A lot of people will say he did it for the divorce, but those are people who only read headlines. There are a lot of complicated reasons for why Henry would pursue a split from Rome. Among them, certainly, is the influence of the Boleyn family, who were Protestants. But also, Henry didn't like the idea of all the money leaving the kingdom and going to the Pope. That was part of what being being a member of the church with a capital C meant. You had to pay dues. And so this is money that people are sending not to the king and not for the welfare of England, but they're sending it to Rome for the welfare of the Pope. And there was a real fear that the people might turn against their king if the Pope asked them to. So Anglicanism, in Henry's mind, has a twofold need, and maybe even a morefold need. But I'm just smart enough to know about the twofold need. If you know more folds, please share them with me. But the twofold needs for Henry are, it keeps people from betraying the crown by making them all become Anglicans. So there are secret Catholics. And that becomes an issue for James I, a raving homosexual, who translated the Bible. So all you fundamentalists, gay gesund. Anyway, I don't even know why I started down this rant, and I don't feel the need to conclude it, except by making my tone sound certain. Let's just keep going with this. Then his preaching was ingenious and pithy, like the preaching of the English church in its robust age. and his sermons were delivered without book. People outside his parish went to hear him, and since to fill the church was always the most difficult part of the clergyman's function, here was another ground for a careless sense of superiority. Besides, he was a likable man, sweet-tempered, ready-witted, frank, without grins of suppressed bitterness or other conversational flavors which make half of us an affliction to our friends. Lydgate liked him heartily and wished for his friendship. So I think in the last episode, I was sort of I'm going to say ambivalent. You may remember it differently. I don't watch these, so who knows? But I wasn't sort of super crazy about Lydgate or Fairbrother in the previous chapter, except was that not the hottest chapter? Did you just fudge yourself stupid the whole time? Like, don't tell me because I am a Victorian prude, but also tell me. Anyway, I think that we are to understand that Lydgate, in this chapter, Eliot's intent is these are good men that stand for the right values. And so we've talked about, I'm almost positive we've talked about death of the author. So really quickly, death of the author at its very bare minimum, like the wooden floors of death of the author are the author, whatever the author intended has no impact on interpreting the novel. In fact, you should not even listen to the author. The author, like, it gets really Handmaid's Tale with death of the author. Like, the author was only necessary to produce the work, but the work itself is its own thing. So I don't subscribe to that necessarily. I think we should know what the author was intending if the author lets us know. Authors now have become wily, and they spend a lot of time telling you how little they know. Oh, well, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to leave it up to the reader. When, you know what, you should know the answer to that because it's your book and you should know the lay of the land. Usually what's happened is the character has achieved some sort of trickery, and then everybody wants to know, oh, like that's the question they ask. Oh, and then the author says, no, I can't tell you. Anyway, George Eliot's not that. And I think she's telling us these are two good men. So let's keep going. With this feeling uppermost, he continued to weigh the question of the chaplaincy and to persuade himself that it was not only no proper business of his, but likely enough never to vex him with the demand for his vote. Lydgate, at Mr. Bulstrode's request, was laying down plans for the internal arrangements of the new hospital, and the two were often in consultation. The banker, again, remember, the banker is somehow in charge of the hospital, which is our present, but anyway. The banker was always presupposing that he could count in general on Lydgate as a coadjutor, but made no special recurrence to the coming decision between Tyke and Fairbrother. When the general board of the infirmary had met, however, and Lydgate had noticed that the question of the chaplaincy was thrown on a council of the directors and medical men to meet on the following Friday, he had a vexed sense that he must make up his mind on this trivial Middlemarch business. He could not help hearing within him the distinct declaration that Bulstrode was prime minister, and that the Tyke affair was a question of office or no office. But he could not help an equally pronounced dislike to giving up the prospect of office, for his observation was constantly confirming Mr. Fairbrother's assurance that the banker would not overlook opposition. Confound their petty politics, was one of his thoughts for 3 mornings in the meditative process of shaving, when he had begun to feel that he must really hold a court of conscience on this matter. Certainly there are valid things to be said against the election of Mr. Fairbrother. He had too much on his hands already, especially considering how much time he spent on non-clerical occupations, those beetles. Then again, it was a continually repeated shock, disturbing Lydgate's esteem, that the vicar should obviously play for the sake of money, liking the play indeed, but evidently liking some end which it served. Mr. Fairbrother contented on theory for the desirability of all games, and said that Englishmen's wit was stagnant for want of them. But Lydgate felt certain that he would have played very much less but for the money. There was a billiard room at the Green Dragon. Isn't there a Green Dragon in Tolkien? Which some anxious mothers and wives regarded as the chief temptation in Middlemarch. Oh, by the way, you know what's super gross are strip clubs that call themselves the Office, because like every man who goes there makes the same joke ad nauseum about how just tell my wife I'm at the office. Wink. And oh, we hate women so much in this society. There was a billiard room at the Green Dragon, which some anxious mothers and wives regarded as the chief temptation in Middlemarch. The vicar was a first-rate billiard player, and though he did not frequent the Green Dragon, there were reports that he had sometimes been there in the daytime and had won money. And as to the chaplaincy, he did not pretend that he cared for it except for the sake of the 40 pounds. Lydgate was no Puritan, but he did not care for play, and winning money at it had always seemed a meanness to him. Besides, he had an ideal of life which made this subservience of conduct to the gaining of small sums thoroughly hateful to him. Hitherto in his own life, his wants had been supplied. Do you guys hear the chair squeak when I move? Yeah, I need to be mindful of that. Like, I don't put my elbows on the table, and maybe I need to be careful about how I wiggle about. Hitherto in his own life, his wants had been supplied without any trouble to himself, and his first impulse was always to be liberal with half-crowns as matters of no importance to a gentleman. It had never occurred to him to devise a plan for getting half-crowns. He had always known in a general way that he was not rich, but he had never felt poor, and he had no power of imagining the part which the want of money plays in determining the actions of men. Money had never been a motive to him. Hence, he was not ready to frame excuses for this deliberate pursuit of small gains. It was altogether repulsive to him, and he never entered into any calculation of the ratio between the vicar's income and his more or less necessary expenditure. It was possible that he would not have made such a calculation in his own case. And now, when the question of voting had come, the repulsive fact told more strongly against Mr. Fairbrother than it had done before. One would know much better what to do if men's characters were more consistent, and especially if one's friends were invariably fit for any function they desired to undertake. Lydgate was convinced that if there had been no valid objection to Mr. Fairbrother, he would have voted for him, whatever Bulstrode might have felt on the subject. He did not intend to be a vassal of Bulstrode's. On the other hand, there was Tyke, a man entirely given to his clerical office, who was simply curate at a chapel of ease in St. Peter's Parish, and had time for extra duty. Nobody had anything to say against Mr. Tyke, except that they could not bear him and suspected him of cant. Really, from his point of view, Bulstrode was thoroughly justified. But whichever way Lydgate began to incline, there was something to make him wince delights in being a proud man, he was a little exasperated at being obliged to wince. He did not like frustrating his own best purposes by getting on bad terms with Bulstrode. He did not like voting against Fairbrother and helping to deprive him of function and salary. And the question occurred whether the additional £40 might not leave the vicar free from that ignoble care about winning at cards. Moreover, Lydgate did not like the consciousness that in voting for Tyke, he should be voting on the side obviously convenient for himself. But would the end really be his own convenience? Other people would say so and would allege that he was currying favor with Bulstrode for the sake of making himself important and getting on in the world. What then? He, for his own part, knew that if his personal prospects simply had been concerned, he would not have cared a rotten nut for the banker's friendship or enmity. What he really cared for was a medium for his work, a vehicle for his ideas. And after all, was he not bound to prefer the object of getting a good hospital where he could demonstrate the specific distinctions of fever and test therapeutic results before anything else connected with this chaplaincy? For the first time, Lydgate was feeling the hampering thread-like pressure of small social conditions and their frustrating complexity. At the end of his inward debate, when he set out for the hospital, his hope was really in the energy which is begotten by circumstances, some feeling rushing warmly and making resolve easy, while debate in cool blood had only made it more difficult. However it was, he did not distinctly say to himself on which side he would vote, and all the while he was inwardly resenting the subjection which had been forced upon him. It would have seemed beforehand like a ridiculous piece of bad logic that he, with his unmixed resolutions of independence and his select purposes, should find himself at the very outset in the grasp of petty alternatives, each of which was repugnant to him. In his students' chambers, he had prearranged his social action quite differently. We are going to, just because I now remember that I have it, we're going to pause for a quick second. I'm going to put some pretty lights on, and then I'm going to come back and finish reading. I guess you really only see them on the one side. Anyway, I'm a teen girl. Where did we leave off? Lydgate was late in setting out, but Dr. Sprague, the two other surgeons, and several of the directors had arrived early. Mr. Bulstrode, treasurer and chairman, being among those who were still absent. The conversation seemed to imply that the issue was problematical, and that a majority for Tyke was not so certain as he had generally supposed. The two physicians, for a wonder, turned out to be unanimous, or rather, though of different minds. They concurred in action. Dr. Sprague, the rugged and weighty, was, as everyone had foreseen, an adherent of Mr. Fairbrother. The doctor was more than suspected of having no religion, but somehow Middlemarch tolerated his deficiency in him, as if he had been a Lord Chancellor. Indeed, it is probable that his professional weight was the more believed in the world-old association of cleverness with the evil principle being still potent in the minds even of lady patients who had the strictest ideas of frilling and sentiment. It was perhaps this negation in the doctor which made his neighbors call him hard-headed and dry-witted, conditions of texture which were also held favorable to the storing of judgments connected with drugs. At all events, it is certain that if any medical man had come to Middlemarch with the reputation of having very definite religious views, of being given to prayer, and of otherwise showing an active piety, there would have been a general presumption against his medical skill. That's an interesting idea. On this ground, it was, professionally speaking, fortunate for Dr. Minchin that his religious sympathies were of a general kind. and such as gave a distinct medical sanction to all serious ailment, to all serious sentiment, whether of church or dissent, rather than any adhesion to particular tenets. If Mr. Bulstrode insisted, as he was apt to do, on the Lutheran doctrine of justification as that by which a church must stand or fall, Dr. Minchin, in return, was quite sure that man was not a mere machine or a fortuitous conjunction of atoms. If Mrs. Wimple insisted on a particular providence in relation to her stomach complaint, Dr. Minchin, for his part, liked to keep the mental windows open and objected to fixed limits. If the Unitarian brewer jested about the Athanasian Creed, Dr. Minchin quoted Pope's Essay on Man. He objected to the rather free style of anecdote in which Dr. Sprague, there's a Sprague River in Oregon where I'm from, indulged, preferring well-sanctioned quotations and liking refinements of all kinds. It was generally known that he had some kinship to a bishop and sometimes spent his holidays at the palace. Dr. Minchin was soft-handed, pale-complexioned, and of rounded outline, not to be distinguished from a mild clergyman in appearance, whereas Dr. Sprague was superfluous, I'll just decide it's Sprague, was superfluously tall. His trousers got creased at the knees and showed an excess of boot at a time when straps seemed necessary to any dignity of bearing. You heard him go in and out and up and down as if he had come to see the roofing. In short, he had weight and might be expected to grapple with the disease and throw it, while Dr. Minchin might be better able to detect it lurking and to circumvent it. They enjoyed about equally the mysterious privilege of medical reputation and concealed with much etiquette their contempt for each other's skill. Regarding themselves as Middlemarch institutions, they were ready to combine against all innovators and against non-professionals given to interference. On this ground, they were both in their hearts equally averse to Mr. Bulstrode, though Dr. Minchin had never been in open hostility with him, and never differed from him without elaborate explanation to Dr. Sprague, sorry. And boy, did I lose my place. Regarding themselves, we're just going to start there. Regarding themselves as Middlemarch institutions, they were ready to combine against all innovators and against non-professionals given to interference. On this ground, they were both in their hearts equally averse to Mr. Bulstrode, though Dr. Minchin had never been in open hostility with him and never differed from him without elaborate explanation to Mrs. Bulstrode, who had found that Dr. Minchin alone understood her constitution. A layman who pried into the professional conduct of contract was nevertheless offensive to the professional nostril as such, and Dr. Minchin shared fully in the new pique against Bulstrode, excited by his apparent determination to patronize Lydgate. The long-established practitioners, Mr. Wrench and Mr. Toller, were just now standing apart and having a friendly colloquy in which they agreed that Lydgate was a jackanapes just made to serve Bulstrode's purpose. To non-medical friends, they had already concurred in praising the other young practitioner who had come into the town on Mr. Peacock's retirement without further recommendation than his own merits in such arguments for solid professional requirement as might be gathered from his having apparently wasted no time on other branches of knowledge. It was clear that Lydgate, by not dispensing drugs, intended to cast imputations on his equals and also to obscure the limit between his own rank as a general practitioner and that of the physician, who, in the interest of the profession, felt bound to maintain its various grades, especially against a man who had not been to either of the English universities and enjoyed the absence of anatomical and bedside study there, but came with a libelous pretension to experience in Edinburgh and Paris, where observation might be abundant indeed, but hardly sound. Thus it happened that on this occasion, let's get this right. Oh, nope. Sorry, this is, okay, so maybe this is a mark against reading from the computer. Thus it happened that on this occasion, Bulstrode became identified with Lydgate and Lydgate with Tyke, and owing to his variety of interchangeable names for the chaplaincy question, diverse minds were unable to form the same judgment concerning it. Dr. Sprague, Dr. Sprague said at once bluntly to the group assembled when he entered, "I go for Fairbrother. A salary with all my heart. But why take it from the vicar? He is none too much. Has to insure his life besides keeping house and doing the vicar's charities. Put £40 in his pocket and you'll do no harm. He's a good fellow, is Fairbrother, with as little of the parson about him as will serve to carry orders." "Ho, ho, doctor," said old Mr. Powderell, a retired ironmonger of some standing, his interjection being something between a laugh and a parliamentary disapproval. "We must let you have your say, but what we have to consider is not anybody's income, it's the souls of the poor sick people." Here, Mr. Powderell's voice and face had a sincere pathos in them. "He is a real gospel preacher, is Mr. Tyke. I should vote against my conscience if I voted against Mr. Tyke. I should indeed." "Mr. Tyke's opponents have not asked anyone to vote against his conscience, I believe," said Mr. Hackbutt, a rich tanner of fluent speech, whose glittering spectacles and erect hair were turned with some severity towards innocent Mr. Powderell. "But in my judgment, it behooves us as directors to consider whether we will regard it as our whole business to carry out propositions emanating from a single quarter. Will any member of the committee aver that he would have entertained the idea of displacing the gentleman who has always discharged the function of chaplain here, if it had not been suggested to him by parties whose disposition it is to regard every institution of this town as a machinery for carrying out their own views? I tax no man's motives, let them lie between himself and a higher power, but I do say that there are influences at work here which are incomparable with genuine independence. Crawling servility is usually dictated by circumstances which gentlemen so conducting themselves could not afford either morally or financially to avow. I myself am a layman, but I have given no inconsiderable attention to the divisions in the church and—" "Oh, damn the diversions," burst in Mr. Frank Hawley, lawyer and town clerk, who rarely presented himself at the board, but now looked in hurriedly, whip in hand. "We have nothing to do with them here. Fairbrother has been doing the work, what there was, without pay, and if pay is to be given, it should be given to him. I call it a confounded job to take the thing away from Fairbrother. I think it would be as well for gentlemen not to give their remarks a personal bearing," said Mr. Plymdale. "I shall vote for the appointment of Mr. Tyke, but I should not have known if Mr. Hackbutt hadn't hinted it, that I was a servile crawler. I disclaim any personalities. I expressly said, if I may be allowed to repeat, or even to conclude what I was about to say—" "Ah, here's Minchin," said Frank Hawley, at which point everyone turned away from Mr. Hackbutt, leaving him to feel the uselessness of superior gifts in Middlemarch. "Come, doctor, I must have you on the right side, eh?" "Well, I hope so," said Dr. Minchin, nodding and shaking hands here and there. "It would ever cost to my feelings." "If there's any feeling here, it should be feeling for the man who was turned out, I think," said Mr. Frank Hawley. "I confess I have feelings on the other side also. I have a divided esteem, said Dr. Minchin, rubbing his hands. I consider Mr. Tyke an exemplary man, none more so, and I believe him to be proposed from unimpeachable motives. I, for my part, wish that I could give him my vote, but I am constrained to take a view of the case which gives the preponderance to Mr. Fairbrother's claims. He is an amiable man, an able preacher, and has been longer among us. Old Mr. Powderall looked on, sad and silent. Mr. Plymdale settled his cravat uneasily. You don't set up Fairbrother as a pattern of what a clergyman ought to be, I hope, said Mr. Larcher, the eminent carrier who had just come in. I have no ill will towards him, but I think we owe something to the public not to speak of anything higher in these appointments. In my opinion, Fairbrother is too lax for a clergyman. I don't wish to bring up particulars against him, but he will make a little attendance here go as far as he can. And a devilish deal better than too much, said Mr. Holly, whose bad language was notorious in that part of the country. Sick people can't bear so much praying and preaching, and that methodistical sort of religion is bad for the spirits, bad for the inside, he added, turning quickly round to the four medical men who were assembled. But any answer was dispensed with by the entrance of three gentlemen with whom they were greetings more or less cordial. These were the Reverend Edward Thesiger, rector of St. Peter's, Mr. Bulstrode, and our friend Mr. Brooke of Tipton. You remember Mr. Brooke? He is Dorothea and Celia's uncle, who had lately allowed himself to be put on board of directors in his turn, but had never before attended, his attendance now being due to Mr. Bulstrode's exertions. Lydgate was the only person still expected. Everyone now sat down, Mr. Bulstrode presiding, pale and self-restrained as usual. Mr. Thesiger, a moderate evangelical, wished for the appointment of his friend Mr. Tyke, a zealous, able man who, officiating at a chapel of ease, had not a cure of souls too extensive to leave him ample time for the new duty. It was desirable that chaplaincies of this kind should be entered on with a fervent intention. They were peculiar opportunities for spiritual influence, and while it was good that a salary should be allotted, there was the more need for scrupulous watching, lest the office should be perverted into a mere question of salary. Mr. Thesiger's manner had so much quiet propriety that objectors could only simmer in silence. Mr. Brooke believed that everybody meant well in the matter. He had not himself attended to affairs of the infirmary, though he had a strong interest in whatever was for the benefit of Middlemarch, and was most happy to meet the gentlemen present on any public question. Any public question, you know, Mr. Brooke repeated, with his nod of perfect understanding. I am a good deal occupied as a magistrate and in the collection of documentary evidence, but I regard my time as being at the disposal of the public. And in short, my friends have convinced me that a chaplain with a salary, you know, is a very good thing. And I'm happy to be able to come here and vote for the appointment of Mr. Tyke, who I understand is an unexceptionable man, apostolic and eloquent, and everything of that kind. And I'm the last man to withhold my vote under the circumstances, you know. We're getting dangerously close to acting night, though. Just be aware of that. And let's try to get, there we go. It seems to me that you have been crammed with one side of the question, Mr. Brooke, said Mr. Frank Hawley, who was afraid of nobody and was a Tory suspicious of electioneering intentions. You don't seem to know that one of the worthiest men we have has been doing duty as a chaplain here for years without pay, and that Mr. Tyke is proposed to supersede him. Excuse me, Mr. Hawley, said Mr. Bulstrode. Mr. Brooke has been fully informed of Mr. Fairbrother's character and position. By his enemies, flashed out Mr. Hawley. I trust there is no personal hostility concerned here, said Mr. Thesiger. I'll swear there is, though, retorted Mr. Hawley. Gentlemen, said Mr. Bulstrode in a subdued tone, the merits of the question may be very briefly stated, and if anyone present doubts that every gentleman who is about to give his vote has not been fully informed, I can now recapitulate the considerations that should weigh on either side. I don't see the good of that, said Mr. Hawley. I suppose we all know whom we mean to vote for. Any man who wants to do justice does not wait till the last minute to hear both sides of the question. I have no time to lose, and I propose that the matter be put to the vote at once. A brief but still hot discussion followed before each person wrote Tyke or Fairbrother on a piece of paper and slipped it into a glass tumbler. And in the meantime, Mr. Bulstrode saw Lydgate enter. I perceive that the votes are equally divided at present, said Mr. Bulstrode in a clear, biting voice. Then looking up at Lydgate, there is a casting vote still to be given. It is yours, Mr. Lydgate. Will you be good enough to write? The thing is settled now, said Mr. Wrench, rising. We all know how Mr. Lydgate will vote. You seem to speak with some peculiar meaning, sir, said Lydgate, rather defiantly, and keeping his pencil suspended. I merely mean that you are expected to vote with Mr. Bulstrode. Do you regard that meaning as offensive? It may be offensive to others, but I shall not desist from voting with him on that account. Lydgate immediately wrote down Tyke. So the Reverend Walter Tyke became chaplain to the infirmary, and Lydgate continued to work with Mr. Bulstrode. He was really uncertain whether Tyke were not the more suitable candidate, and yet his consciousness told him that if he had been quite free from indirect bias, he should have voted for Fairbrother. The affair of the chaplaincy reclaimed a sore point in his memory as a case in which this petty medium of Middlemarch had been too strong for him. How could a man be satisfied with the decision between such alternatives and under such circumstances? No more than he can be satisfied with his hat, which he has chosen from among such shapes as resources of the age offer him, wearing it at best with resignation, which is chiefly supported by comparison. But Mr. Fairbrother met him with the same friendliness as before. The character of the publican and sinner is not always practically incompatible with that of the modern Pharisee, for the majority of us scarcely see more distinctly the faultiness of our own conduct than the faultiness of our own arguments or the dullness of our own jokes. But the vicar of St. Botolph's had certainly escaped the slightest tincture of the Pharisee, and by dint of admitting to himself that he was too much as other men were, he had become remarkably unlike them in this, and he could excuse others for thinking slightly of him, and could judge impartially of their conduct, even when it told against him. The world has been too strong for me, I know, he said one day to Lydgate. But then, I am not a mighty man. I shall never be a man of renown. The choice of Hercules is a pretty fable, but Protagonist makes it easy work for the hero, as if the first resolves were enough. Another story says that he came to hold the distaff and at last wore the Nessus shirt, or Nessus shirt. Again, I suppose one good resolve might keep a man right if everybody else's resolve helped him. The vicar's talk was not always inspiring. He had escaped being a Pharisee, but he had not escaped that low estimate of possibilities, which we rather hastily arrive at as an inference from our own failure. Lydgate thought that there was a pitiable infirmity of will. I'm sorry. Lydgate thought there was a pitiable infirmity of will in Mr. Fairbrother. And that's it. We did it. Chapter 18, done, in the can. Boy, am I sweaty. I mean, look, spread your tiny wings and fly away. You can't with this much water on your body. There will be fall, right? We'll get back fall. I hope so. Anyway, this is Ben. Yeah, see, there I am looking for where the stop is. Actually, I should just go here. But, oh, here would be better. This has been Footnotes. I have been and will continue to be Mike Bevel. And we just finished chapter 18 of Middlemarch. We will do chapter 19 next. And maybe I'll do it tomorrow. Wouldn't that be something?